The Jeep Gladiator is undeniably one of the most desirable midsize pickup trucks. Thanks to its distinctive looks, fantastic off-road readiness, and unbelievably high levels of towing and payload capacity, it's no wonder why people tend to love it. However, we'd be lying if we said that it was all milk and honey with the Gladiator, as it's also plagued with various issues, some of which have deterred customers for years now and keep doing so. Today, we'll be addressing the most important of those as we look at the 5 problems with the Jeep Gladiator that you must know. Number 5. Completely outdated powertrain. What we simply cannot fathom is the fact that the Jeep Gladiator has been offered exclusively with the 3.6 Pentastar V6 for years now, without any indication of it being replaced, which is just stupid. Now don't get us wrong, the 3.6 Pentastar V6 isn't a terrible engine, it's just, well, it's mediocre compared to the competition to say the least. Sure, it's nice to have a pickup truck that comes with a fairly competent engine as standard. Having 285 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque from the get-go is a pretty good ordeal, as well as having 6 cylinders, especially since most of the pack comes with a measly 4-cylinder as standard. However, once you start optioning out the more powerful engines, they start far outclassing the Gladiator's 3.6. For example, the Ford Ranger's 2.7-liter EcoBoost V6 produces 30 HP and over 140 pound-feet of torque more than the Pentastar, and the Ranger Raptor only bumps these numbers even further. The ideal answer to this would have been the Hemi engine that Jeep could have taken straight from the Jeep Wrangler. However, with Stellantis practically burying the V8 alive, this will most certainly not be the case for the future. On the other hand, they could have introduced the Hurricane 6 with last year's redesign. However, even if that isn't going to happen for the foreseeable future, the Toyota Tacoma, albeit not as powerful as the Gladiator, offers a hybrid drivetrain, which grants it 5 to 6 more mpg on average, which is especially prominent around town. Again, the hybrid drivetrain from the 4xe Wrangler could have been translated here too, but Jeep and Stellantis seem to hate attracting buyers to their vehicles. Number 6. Interior leaves a lot to be desired. In addition to powertrain troubles, hopping inside of the Gladiator will show a whole heap of new problems. For example, the pre-facelifted vehicle's interior is by far amongst the worst interiors we ever saw. The vast majority of the materials used are so nasty and so cheap to look at and touch that we simply cannot fathom how anybody at Stellantis could have ever greenlit this. In addition to that, the technology used in the pre-facelift model is also terrible. Just look at that hideous 8.4-inch Uconnect infotainment screen. It looks like someone just stuck a 10-year-old iPad and masked it with some plastic trim. And you know what's the worst part? That 10-year-old iPad would have probably done a better job than this screen. It lags, it looks dated, and using it is so convoluted that you're far better off never even indulging in using it. Finally, the seats, especially on the entry-level models, had loads of issues. Cloth creasing prematurely, not enough side bolstering or padding, you name it, it was there. Now, the facelift admittedly fixed most of these issues. First of all, the interior materials, albeit still not great, are okay now. The dash is made mostly of soft-touch materials. The seats have a better shape and are more durable, and everything just seems better than before. In addition to that, the new 12.3-inch screen is far nicer to use and look at, and the UI is far more logical than before. That said, there's still a lot to be desired inside of the Gladiator compared to the Ford Ranger and the Toyota Tacoma, but the new interior is definitely a far cry compared to the previous generation. Number 3. Terrible on-road performance. However, what's colloquially regarded as terrible, regardless of generation, is how god-awful the Gladiator is on the road. Seriously, what in the world was Stellantis thinking? Yeah, sure, some of you might try and defend the Gladiator by calling it an off-road truck, and albeit that makes sense, you still have to take into consideration that 90% of them are still going to spend at least 2/3 of their life on the road. So what's the issue? Well, apart from the fact that the suspension feels like jello every time you hit the bends, and apart from the fact that the vehicle bounces and rolls constantly, nothing much. In addition to that, driving at higher speeds is extremely noisy, as the Gladiator is as aerodynamic as an average box, maybe even less than that. But truth be told, this simply isn't something Jeep could have fixed, as it would have required them to completely change the look of the truck. That simply isn't going to work, as it would also require the Wrangler to change its shape, which is a no-no since it's retained the same look for decades. What Jeep should have done is make the truck a bit more rigid suspension-wise, which would have helped with comfort on open roads significantly. That said, they shouldn't overdo it either, as currently it's pretty comfy over potholes, and because of the elastic suspension, it's pretty good at towing and off-roading. Number 2. Entry-level models are severely under-equipped. Truth be told, the Jeep Gladiator was a laughingstock in its lower trim levels, as Stellantis literally tried selling us a steering wheel and some seats and calling it a day. Both the pre-facelift and last year's facelift of the Gladiator have, for the lower end trim levels and especially the Sport and the Nighthawk, been completely poverty spec. Just so you get a perspective of how bad it was, neither of these came as standard with electric windows, and we're not talking about the rear seats. No, you had crank operated windows at the front. In addition to that, halogen headlights were standard on most trims, which is just unacceptable in 2024. Sure, we understand them being standard on the base trim level. In addition to this, most of the lineup has been mated to a 6-speed manual transmission as standard. Now, this isn't a bad thing if you intend on only going off-road. However, most people in the US still have a hard time with manual transmissions, and with automatics becoming more and more present worldwide, this isn't going to change. Now, we all expected this to change for the 2024 redesign. However, ironically enough, despite all the surface level changes, these things remain the same. Thankfully though, after a massive backlash from fans and critics alike, Jeep decided to give us something more for the 2025 model year. And would you imagine it? Your $40,000 truck now comes with electric windows and an automatic transmission as standard. Oh, and that brings us to the final, and in our opinion, the biggest issue with the new Gladiator. Number 1, an extremely high price tag. $40,000. $40,000. Honestly, we're at a complete loss for words. Imagine paying 40 grand for a vehicle so severely under-equipped next to its vastly affordable competition. And for that kind of money, you'll just be getting the base Jeep Gladiator Sport, which, albeit better equipped than the previous year, is still very poverty spec next to the $10,000 cheaper alternatives. For example, the Chevy Colorado, which is the most affordable offering in the midsize pickup truck segment, will come with an even better screen that will be paired with a fully digital gauge cluster. The seats will also be a bit more comfortable, albeit truth be told, the Jeep becomes superior in this regard once you start climbing the trim level ladder. However, the Colorado's posher brother, the GMC Canyon, yet again outclasses the Jeep in this regard. First of all, its base trim, which is around 4 grand cheaper than the Gladiator, offers a far better interior with much more premium materials, a more frugal power plant, and a greater towing capacity. And albeit not quite as good off-road as the Gladiator, both the Colorado and Canyon can still fare pretty well in this regard. That said, both of these trucks are far too harsh for on-road driving, as their suspension has been firmed up to oblivion to retain rigidity on-road because of their tail ride height. That's where the Tacoma steps in. You see, unlike every other midsize pickup truck in the segment, the Tacoma comes with coil spring suspension at the back, which allows it to be much more engaging to drive while also being able to absorb bumps pretty well, all while offering fantastic off-road performance. In addition to that, the Tacoma is also quite noticeably cheaper than the Gladiator, offering a pretty solid amount of kit and quality for the money. For example, a mid to high range TRD off-road trim costs virtually the same as the Gladiator Sport, and it absolutely annihilates it in every possible way. Not to mention that the Tacoma Off-Road Hybrid and Sport Hybrid costs as much as the Gladiator Willys, which is basically the first real Gladiator trim you should consider. The truth is, the Gladiator's faults would have been easier to swallow if it were cheaper, but as is, Stellantis will have to work hard to catch up to the competition.